Hi, it's Dr. Crone. Welcome to the first video in our unit on nations and nationalism. You've probably heard the word nation before, and you probably think of it as a synonym for the word country. That's how the word is often used in ordinary speech. But in political science, the term is more than just a synonym for country. A nation in political science is a culturally distinctive group of people that envisions itself as needing or deserving self-government. So it's a group of people who have shared political aspirations. That's just another word for goals. They have a goal. Either they already govern themselves or they think they should. And it's sometimes or often connected to ethnicity or ethnic identity, but not always. So we can think of an example like the Irish or the Italians, the Japanese, the Russians. Those represent a nation. It's different than a state or a government or even a geographical area. It's really an identity. So when someone says to you, who are you or where do you come from? You say, I am Mexican or I am Austrian or something like that. National identity is a very important concept in politics and government, partly because it can be manipulated by politicians and it often drives wars, revolutions, and other major political upheavals. One question political scientists have wrestled to understand is, where does this idea of a national identity come from? In other words, how does a group of people come to think of themselves as belonging to a nation? And political scientists have three sort of different and somewhat competing theories about that. One theory says that national identity has always been there. It's just kind of baked into a system. It goes back far, far, far into history. It's based on race and ancient culture and geography, and in a primordialist idea, you might say, well, Albanians have always been Albanians. They have this language that binds them together. They have this ancient, ancient history. And they've always lived in this place, and that's what gives them the sense that, yes, they're a group and they deserve self-government. But that's not the only theory. So there are competing theories that says, no, it's not as permanent or as sort of natural as primordialism. Rather, national identity comes from some kind of structure within the society and the needs of that structure. And usually a structuralist is talking about the economy. The needs of an economy, for example, are going to try to unite a workforce, and it's capitalists who need a flexible workforce, need people who share the same language and share the same values. And so it is, the idea here is that a national identity becomes structured by the needs of the country itself, and especially the needs of a capitalist workforce. And then the idea, which is related to it but even more modern, is an idea called constructivism. And constructivism says that actually it's not just the structure of the economy or ancient history, it's that national identity is shaped and manipulated by the elites of society, by people, often political elites, people with power or people who want power or want to hang on to power. Or people who want to create a rebellion or something like that, so that they can get what they want. And that actually a national identity is more of what might be considered an imaginary concept, that people assume is ancient, and we are Italians because we are Italian. But I'm going to talk to you about Italians in a minute, and you'll see kind of a really good example of something that supports this idea of an imaginary concept. Constructivism is probably the most popular understanding of where national identity comes from today among comparative political scientists. There are people who specifically study nationalism and national identity, and most people believe a version of the constructivist theory. So let's talk about Italy. So Italy is a really good example of the constructivist theory of the nation as an imaginary construct. So I don't know about you, but before I studied political science, I assumed that Italy was an ancient nation, that it had roots of history long back into and that the Italian language was ancient, Italian art and all of that seemed like, hey, it's really old. We go back to Michelangelo, we go back to Roman times. But actually, the nation of Italy, the country of Italy, has only existed since 1861. It's a fairly new country. And even the language Italian, the Italian that is spoken today by Italians, um, was not an official language until the 1800s. It's an amalgam of the many different languages that people who lived in the area we now think of as Italy live. And so this map shows you all the different states really that were part of what we now think of as Italy. Sardinia and the two Sicilies and all those kind of states you can see on this map. They were all individual states, nation states in many ways. And what happened was the Austrians were, and the Austrian Empire was always threatening Italy or threatening these small nation states. And by the 1800s, it became clear that forming a larger country out of all of uniting these little city states would help to resist against Austrian occupation, that um, it would create a unified country, and that would be good for getting rid of the Austrians and making sure that they didn't take over. Um, and another example, so Italy's a great example. Another example is the Korean identity, the idea of Korean as sort of a separate national identity deserving its own self-rule. The really Koreans ruled themselves for many centuries, but the fact of them as having a national identity as separate from some other nation only came into being in the early 1900s, and it was mostly a reaction against an invasion by the Japanese. And what developed was this idea that Koreans, it's called Minjok, Koreans are a unique race of brave warriors going back into ancient times. But really, all of those stories and myths were kind of invented as a way to unite the Koreans against the Japanese occupation. So knowing all of that, that's a good background for you to apply to the case study you've read about the development of a Japanese national identity. So what I'd like you to do, one of the things you could do for your discussion board is think about what you've learned so far and apply it to what you read in that case study about sort of the development of a nationalized Japan. So nationalism is a word that's often referred to in politics, and it is an extremely powerful force of the people that can have very important political consequences. So nationalism means a sense of group pride in your group's identity and a group desire for self-government. Um, what goes along with nationalism is this sense that we as a group are different from, our nation is different from other nations. And you can't join our nation. It's not up for immigration or anything else like that. It's a limited, closed nation. We're bound by language and culture, and we're the cool people, and the other people are the outsiders. Nationalism, it's easy to confuse it with patriotism and just being patriotic and saying, yes, I love my country. But in many ways, it runs deeper than that, and it is a shared sense of sort of entitlement in many ways. Nationalism can be a positive thing. Certainly, that feeling of unity, for example, helped Italy to, get rid of the Austrians and have their own independent country. So nationalism can be positive. But nationalism in politics often has a very dark side. It can be associated with all the things you see on this slide, with violence, with isolationism, refusing to cooperate with other countries, scapegoating other groups that are nations that are not us, scapegoating of outgroups, ideas of racial superiority or supremacy. People who are like us racially are the best and the other people are inferior, which can lead to all kinds of political suppression of the outgroups. Terrorism is often associated with nationalism, particularly a nation that feels powerless within a larger state that doesn't recognize it. Nationalism is extremely identified with fascism, with the ideology of fascism, which was inherent in Nazi Germany and Italy. Today, in sort of the modern Western world, we are seeing a strong resurgence of nationalism in our own country, in America. At least that's my country, sorry. I know some of you may not be from America. But in many other European countries, we see right-wing nationalist parties in France, in Germany, in many of the former Soviet states, and it is in England. And it is a concern to many public policy makers who see that, nationalism isn't all bad, but it can have really negative consequences. So at this point, you're probably starting to get the concept of what is and is not a nation, but be careful not to jump to the conclusion that all ethnic groups are a nation, because not all ethnic groups are. To be a nation, an ethnic group has to have political aspirations towards self-government, and by aspirations, I mean hopes, dreams, goals. It also needs to be somewhat geographically cohesive. At least at one time it was historically cohesive. So it's not just any old ethnic group. So how do we tell what is a nation and what is just an ethnic group? It's not always easy to say, but we look at, does that group express the desire to govern themselves in some way? And are they moving towards that as a goal of governing themselves? So the United States is a really tricky case to try to understand nationalism, because we do have nationalism of being American, but we also have lots and lots of ethnic groups who have an identity as an ethnic group. So most ethnic groups in the United States don't qualify as nations because they're not trying to govern themselves. So for example, Italian Americans or Mexican Americans are not trying to say we need to overthrow the government of the United States and make this a country where we rule ourselves. In fact, there aren't even any little enclaves of groups like that that are trying to control a small amount of the United States. So most ethnic groups don't qualify as nations. Most are descended from immigrants from other nations, and they may identify at least partially as belonging to the nation they came from, but they also see themselves as Americans and recognize the legitimacy and sovereignty of the US government. The one exception could be Native Americans. Are Native Americans a nation? Probably, most likely. Are African Americans a nation? Probably not. Certainly African Americans in the United States have many grievances against the US government for very good reasons. And certainly there is a lot of political activity among the African American ethnic group for better treatment, more equality, etc. But African Americans are not asking to rule themselves in their own geographically cohesive area. They're saying, we want to be part of this this culture and this particular. We want the state that governs us to recognize us as a legitimate group and to give us rights that are when we're being discriminated against. So it is tricky. It's tricky to tell the difference between the two. So now we get to the question of, okay, we know what a nation is, and we've talked about what a state is. Are they the same thing? And the answer is no. Not every nation is a state, and not every nation even has a state. Some states, in other words, governments, have more than one nation within their borders. Some nations have more than one state within their borders. So, and here we're not talking about immigration. So we're not talking about the fact that the US has people from all different ethnic groups all over the United States. That's not what we're talking about, because most of those people came here voluntarily, with the exclusion of African Americans who are descended from enslaved peoples. But other than that, most people who are an ethnic group in the United States don't count as a nation. Okay, so why might a nation and a state be different from each other? Political boundaries, which are state boundaries, don't always go along with ethnic or national boundaries. So a good example of this might be Ireland, where there's the country, the state of Ireland, but then there's also people who identify with the Irish nation who are actually part of Britain, or the United Kingdom. And that's the northern part of Ireland. So state boundaries don't always go along with the boundaries of a nation. And that usually happens due to war, colonization. Sometimes there's unification in order to form a new country, like with Italy, had a lot of different nations. So in our next video, we're going to talk a lot more about the different relationships that a nation can have with a state. Okay, that's the end of the first video for this unit. Make sure that you view the second video and read all the assigned readings before you post to the discussion board, and before you take your quiz. So that's all we've got, and I'll see you in the next video on nations and nationalism.